Please open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 6. I'm going to read verses 1 through 11, and if you are using one of our Luke journals, that's going to be on page 44 as we continue to make our way through the book of Luke. And if you do not have one of these and would like them, there are some sitting right over there by the offering box. Feel free to help yourself. Luke chapter 6, reading verses 1 through 11, reading from the English Standard Version, this is what it says. On a Sabbath, while he, that's Jesus, was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some of the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there, and Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Well, if you remember, last week, Pastor Gary was filling in. I wasn't here, so you need to remember back 2 weeks. We were talking about how Jesus was redefining religion. And he was bringing in this new way of believing in God and this new faith that was about inward transformation instead of outward conformity to a list of rules. And he was talking to the Pharisees and the scribes, and even if you remember, the disciples of, remember who they were? John the Baptist, yes, even his disciples were coming to Jesus, and they were all struggling with this new concept of this righteousness that comes by being transformed by God and his law being put in our hearts instead of following this list of rules, and they were struggling with this. And if you remember, his final words to them included this, and it's right at the top of the page if you're in your journal. He says, "And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed." He was talking about how hard it is to change and to accept this new kind of faith in God that relies on transformation. Well, guess what? The old wineskins were beginning to burst. These people were having trouble. They were struggling to accept what Jesus had said. And that is right where Luke picks up for our reading this morning. As their wineskins are being stretched beyond consideration, they don't know how to accept these new things he's saying and doing, and their wineskins are just about to burst. And that's where Luke picks up this morning. That is why it is good to look at the life of Jesus in sequence the way we are and the way Luke wrote it. So we take the Gospel of Luke and we're going straight through it because these things build on each other. And in this case, the principle was laid out 2 weeks ago. And then this week, it is really being demonstrated how the wineskins are being stretched. Jesus says the wineskins are going to burst, and then we see them bursting. He gives us 2 instances, Luke does here, where the Pharisees are struggling with this new way that Jesus has brought to them. And both of these instances pertain to one particular area of the law that the Pharisees will continue to struggle with Jesus. They will struggle over this one concept again and again with Jesus. Can anybody tell me from the verses we read what that issue is they were struggling with? The Sabbath, you got it. Very good. They were struggling over the issue of keeping the Sabbath. Now, let's get a little deeper there. Who can tell me, this is for an extra star, right? Now, Pastor Don's got to refill the gumball machine, so you won't get a spin this week, but who can tell me what is the Sabbath? Saturday, day of rest. I hear some others. What was that? What was it? Okay, a day to keep holy. There we go. Get my hearing aids turned up, and I'll be able to catch some of those better. Yes, it's the seventh day of the week. For us, that's Saturday. It really is. And God created the universe in 6 days, and then he rested, which doesn't mean he was tired. It means he stopped working on the seventh. And so God made that day a day of stopping and a day of observing him, and he called it the Sabbath, and he told us to keep it holy. Out of the 10 commandments, I could be really mean and ask you to name all 10, but I don't think I could get all 10 in order. I should be able to, but I can't. Anyway, out of the 10 commandments, the commandment to keep the Sabbath holy is number 4. Now think of the priority that gives it. If you were God and you're going to give mankind 10 laws to live by, just 10, and you make the Sabbath one of the 10, that makes it a pretty high priority, doesn't it? And then you put it all the way up to number 4, above murder, above stealing. He says to keep the Sabbath holy. It's kind of a big deal. And the Sabbath then was a real sticking point for the Pharisees. I went through the New Testament, and I counted 6 times that they clashed with Jesus over the issue of the Sabbath. Again and again, they clashed with Jesus over the way they thought he should keep the Sabbath and the way he was keeping it. On one such occurrence, John records it for us in John chapter 5, verse 16, and it says, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things, which was healing and stuff, on the Sabbath. They weren't upset with what he was doing. They were upset with when he was doing it. And he was healing people, as the illustration we just saw in the second half of the passage we read, on the Sabbath. And they didn't think he should be doing that. John expands on that even more if you look down 2 verses to John 5:18, and it says, this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father and making himself equal with God. They were really upset about this Saturday thing with him. He was not following their rules. And that whole struggle, these 6 clashes they had over the Sabbath, it all began right here in Luke chapter 6, verse 1, where we started reading this morning. This is the beginning of their conflict over the Sabbath that will come up again and again. Now, what happened is Jesus and his disciples were walking through a field, and the disciples started picking off some of the heads of grain and rubbing the grain in their hands and eating it as they walked. They were hungry. There was food. They ate. You know, men are really simple creatures. We're not all that complex. There was food. They were hungry. They ate. And they were walking through these fields and doing that. I don't know if you've ever done. I remember doing that one time, walking through it was a soybean field in Indiana, because if you're in Indiana, it's either corn or, depending on the year, then it's soybean. And we're walking through, and I what do these taste like? So I picked one, I rubbed off the husk, and I ate it. Well, that's exactly what they were doing. Soybean, okay, it was fine. Eating a raw soybean, it wasn't thrilling, but that's what they were doing. So they were hungry. And they began to do this. And as they did this, the problem was it happened to be what day? The Sabbath. And right away, the Pharisees are God's narc squad in the New Testament. If you're alive in the 70s, you remember the 70s, that's somebody who's just ratting you out all the time. Well, the Pharisees, they were the self-appointed narc squad of God, and they saw the disciples walking through the field and rubbing this grain in their hands, and they start throwing up their hands saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's the paraphrase of it. Luke says it this way. They said, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? Their leaky wineskins were showing. They were struggling to accept things. Because in all truth, the disciples weren't breaking any laws in what they were doing. It was the fact that they were having trouble accepting this. But they weren't really breaking any real laws. You might have thought it'd be more of a problem that they were walking through some poor farmer's field, these 12 guys, and they all just start picking and eating in this guy's field without getting permission or anything. I would have thought, property rights, that would have been a bigger deal. Somebody might have come out with a pitchfork or a shotgun and chased you out of the field, but that wasn't the issue at all. It isn't even what they were upset about. In fact, there is a provision in the Old Testament, even if that would have been the issue, that God put commandments, he put laws in to help the poor that stated that a farmer must leave the edges and the corners of his field unharvested. Did you know that? So that poor people could go in there and glean. And that's what the disciples were really doing. Remember, they'd left home, they'd left everything to follow him, so they probably fit that demographic of being poor now, and they are in the corners more than likely, picking some of the leftover crop there and eating it, feeding themselves. But you see, the Pharisees were steeped in traditions that went way beyond what the law did. And they had tons of rules surrounding what it meant to keep the Sabbath. In fact, there's a list of rules called the 39 Melchot in Judaism. Even to this day, they had the same 39 rules. I don't think the chart probably made it since we had the wrong deck in there. I had the chart for you, but it looks like the periodical table of elements, and it has 39 things you cannot do on the Sabbath, and they observe these to the T, and they watch them. They want you to observe them so much that you can even get it printed on a T-shirt. You should probably get it on a T-shirt for your wife so as she's walking in front of you, you can read it and know what you can and can't do. It's a simple set of instructions. You can go on the internet now. You can buy it on a pillow. You can get it tattooed. You can get whatever you want so that you have these 39 rules of things you cannot do on the Sabbath. And these included things like reaping and planting and harvesting and winnowing and grinding. In fact, those would have been the 5 things they accused the disciples of doing. Because they were reaping. They picked off these little heads. And then they were winnowing. They took it and they rubbed the husks off, right? And then when they put it in their mouth and they began to chew it, they would have accused them of grinding it at that point. That's not what they were doing at all, is it? But that's the way they interpreted this law, and they were upset that they were not following this list of rules. See, that's legalism. That's what that does to us when we look for ways to apply. We love to formulate. We love to apply things. You remember being in the church in the 70s, how many rules we had and how specific they were. You couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. And if you were involved in the church at all, you had to sign a piece of paper that would say you wouldn't do any of these things. And there's a side of us that loves that form of legalism. We want somebody to tell us just what we can do and just what we can't. Because you see, legalism also offers loopholes because I can look through. And if I've got these 39 things that I can't do, what does that mean about anything not on the list? Fair game. Fair game. I remember the way it works even for us in Christianity sometimes. There was a pastor a long time ago who showed a movie clip in his church, and it was probably just something as simple as a missionary bringing in a movie of what was going on in the field. It wasn't like showing, a cartoon or something like that. He wasn't even VeggieTales or anything like that, but he was showing this thing, and it was a moving picture, and people in his church got all upset. And he's like, well, what's the problem? Because our missionaries always come and we show slides of what's going on in the mission field. And this time I just showed you a movie. And the deacons all stood up and said, yes, still pictures are okay, but moving pictures are sin. And that's the way we like to define stuff. And that's what these Pharisees were doing. And that is legalism. And that's what they were struggling with. I want to know every last detail of what is okay and what is not okay. But then I'm always looking for loopholes of what I can do. That is what they were struggling with. That's why Luke was so specific when he said that the disciples had plucked and eaten some of the grain and rubbing it in their hands. He is letting us know that is exactly what these Pharisees were struggling with. As they saw it, the disciples were breaking the law. As Jesus saw it, this was silliness and a misapplication of the law as God intended it. And that's what he's out to show them in this segment here. Jesus could have argued with them. He could have argued these points with the Pharisees, but instead of getting into a debate with them, he does what he usually does, and he gets to the heart of the issue with them. That's what Jesus always wanted to do. You come to him with some question or some debate or something like that, and you can even do that in your prayers now, but you know what Jesus wants to do? He wants to get to the heart of the issue, and he turns right back to the Pharisees to get to the heart of the issue, and Jesus answers them as he often does. Instead of with an answer, he answers them with a question. They ask him a question, he asks a question back. And what his question to them really was is this: why do you pick and choose when to apply these laws? That's what he's getting at them with them. Why do you pick and choose when you apply the laws of God, and how? It sounded like this when Luke wrote it. Luke wrote this: have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate bread, the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And actually, in this question, Jesus gets a little bit snarky with them. He actually has a little tone to it that you don't see in those words. In some of the other translations, you'll see it where he says, haven't you even read? That even shows that he's really taking it to them on this. It's kind of like when somebody says to you, you hear this, I can't even, and they just stop there. They don't go any further. Jesus says, haven't you even read the Old Testament? Mr. Pharisee, that David did this, and he's taking that kind of tone with them. He's really pushing to burst their wineskins there. It might not seem like the same question to you, but it is the point he's driving at, and I'll show you how. It just takes a little more explanation. Because it goes back to a story in the Old Testament about King David. How many of you are familiar with King David? Let me see your hands. Most of you, not everybody. King David was a king in the Old Testament. Someday I'm going to take you through the life of David. I think that'll be an amazing study to follow his life from beginning to end. He is such an indomitable character in the Old Testament. King David, well, help me out, Larry, a little bit. Tell me some of the things you know that King David did. Great warrior. Okay, he was a great warrior. He conquered the Philistines around him. What else? Okay, that wasn't his favorite thing to have brought up, but yes, he had an affair with one of his 30 mighty men's wife and then killed the guy to cover it up. How about some of the nice things? What else did he do? Don't be shy, folks. What was that? He wrote a lot of the Psalms, yes. You got that big, thick book in the middle of your Bible, the book of Psalms. It's got 150 Psalms in there, sacred songs. He wrote most of them. Not all of them, but most of them. Good one. Anything else? God called him a man after his own heart. We had a discussion on that because you look at some of these things with David and it just shows the grace of God. I take that to mean he was an Old Testament man with a New Testament understanding of forgiveness. Nobody going to mention David and Goliath? Okay, we're going to go, we're definitely going to do the life of David sometime. Yeah, David and Goliath. And all these other battles he fought, and how people would cheer, and they would say, Saul has slain his thousands, but David, his 10,000s. David is basically the favorite king of all of Israel. I would bet if we really looked around the world, we'd find out that David is probably the most famous king of all history. A very important character to these Pharisees. He's the most beloved king in history. And I believe that is why Jesus chose David to make his point about the Pharisees judging his disciples at this point. Because no one would ever want to criticize King David. There's an interesting thing, and to back that up, there's an interesting thing in the Old Testament. You can read about David in 1 and 2 Samuel. And 2 Samuel is really about his reign. You can read about him in 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles paints him in a much nicer light. He's like, oh, this is the David we want everybody to see, because it doesn't even mention that affair with Bathsheba. 2 Samuel does. Chronicles gets him in a nicer light, and we want to show the good side of David. Well, that's the David they're all remembering, but he was human and he was not perfect. No one would want to criticize him. In fact, the Messiah would be known to them as the son of whom? David, yes. They were looking for this Messiah to come and reinstate the Davidic kingdom. That's how much they loved David. Well, I want you to turn to the Old Testament with me, way back to the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 21. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6. 1 Samuel tells us the story of David before he becomes king. And in these verses we're about to read, as you're turning, I'll give you some of the context. David has been anointed to be the next king, replacing King Saul, who was the first king. But King Saul kind of went off the rails, and God said, you can't be king anymore. And he sent Samuel the prophet to anoint David to make him the next king. King Saul has learned about this, and what does he want to do to David? Kill him. He's got a solution to the problem. And he is chasing David all over Israel, trying to kill him. And David has gathered some men to him. And he's very much like Robin Hood and his merry men at this time, as you read through this old part of it. So this story, this little brief incident that Jesus mentions, comes from the time when David is on the run. He's on the lam, hiding from King Saul, who is trying to kill him. And this is what it says, 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. It says, then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the high priest. Nob is a village, and it is where the tabernacle was at that time. And Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you. I'm on a secret mission, he says. And I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now, therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found. He asked the priest for some food. The priest answered David and said, there is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is the consecrated bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women. David answered the priest and said, surely we have been kept from, women have been kept from us, as previously when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord in order to make and put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. That is the instance Jesus is talking about. And this comes into play while David is on the run and David is hiding, and David comes to where the tabernacle was. An amazing thing is the foundations of that tabernacle are still there. We didn't get to go to it because it's where a lot of the hostility is. And even while we were in Israel, there was a gas station that was shot up that was very near this. But the foundations to the tabernacle, which is where they worshiped God before they built the temple, are still there, where David went and did this, and you can see them. But David came there, and he came to the priest who was in charge, Ahimelech, and he asked him if there was any bread or any food that he could give David and his merry men so that they could have something to eat while he was on the run. And Ahimelech, the priest, says to him, there is no ordinary bread on hand, but the consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women. The consecrated bread, also called showbread, also called the bread of the presence, was a special bread that the priest had to keep on a special table in the tabernacle. So if you went in the tabernacle, there was this beautiful gold table, and there would be 12 loaves of bread on the table. And each one of the loaves represented one of the tribes of Israel. And it was as if they were being presented to the Lord. It was a picture of them being interceded for, each of the tribes of Israel, so that they would be in the presence of the Lord. And the priest would have to keep this bread, and they would put it out there on the Sabbath, and they would take away the old stuff, put hot bread out, leave it there for a week, and every Sabbath they would change out this bread. They would keep the loaves, and then the priests were able to take the 12 loaves that were taken off the table, and it was theirs to eat. But they had to eat it there in the tabernacle. They didn't put it in a bag and take it home and slice it up and make sandwiches. The priests were supposed to eat these 12 loaves, and they were to eat them in the tabernacle. It's kind of very similar to how we treat our communion bread and our juice, as like when we had communion this morning. As Pastor Gary said, it's special. This is a sacred thing. It's something Jesus gave us, and we don't just pass out the bread that we use for communion as crackers, and it's not, crackers and juice time. This is a very sacred time because we are remembering what Jesus did for us, and we treat them special because of that. I actually had, when we were in our church up in Muskegon, up in the backwoods of Muskegon there, had a person wander in, and she came in and asked me if she could get some of our communion cups. She didn't go to our church, but she came and asked if she could get some of our communion cups because she was having a party that evening and needed some shot glasses. What do you think I said? You're right. I said, That's just not happening, because these glasses, though they're nothing holy in and of themselves, they are for us to worship God. We have a shortage of understanding in our world for what holiness and sacredness means. But they understood it there. And this bread was only to be eaten by the priests in the tabernacle. And it was a special thing. That is why the priest said to him, making some allowance, I could give you some of this special bread if your guys are keeping themselves right with God. If you want to take part, you have to live the part, he's saying. I read this and I wonder, well, why did he capitulate? Why did he give him the bread at all? Because it wasn't supposed to go to David. It wasn't supposed to go to the soldiers. It wasn't even supposed to go to the king. It was supposed to be eaten by the priests. But we see in the beginning of the story, as soon as he saw David, he was shaking in his boots. It says he was scared. Why is David here? Am I in trouble? Have I done something? Is this guy going to kill me? So, of course, he gave it to David. I'll give you whatever you want. And he gives it over to him. It was surprising that he did, but I understand that that was his motive. He was afraid of David. And when David said, you got some bread? He says, just this, but you can have it. Like I said, on the Sabbath day, they would remove the bread and replace it with the 12 loaves, 12 fresh loaves. As I said, and ours even hot. Brings us to a really interesting point, and it connects it very vividly with what Jesus was saying to the Pharisees, doesn't it? Because what were they arguing about, the Pharisees? They were arguing about keeping the what? Sabbath. And this story that Jesus pulled out of history happened on the Sabbath. Isn't that amazing? Isn't Jesus brilliant? He pulls out an old story about the Sabbath when somebody did something to break the law of God. And he's like, you're all upset at my disciples for taking a little grain and rubbing it in their hands. And you're not even bothered by what David did on the Sabbath. Accused him of violating the Sabbath. They knew this story. He was making that point to him. He is so brilliant. This bread was so sacred, like I said, they didn't even take it home to eat it. And it was, as Jesus said, not lawful for any of the priests, anyone but the priests to eat. Jesus is saying David broke the law by eating this bread. It was God's law. It was not lawful for David to take the bread from the priest and to share it with his comrades. There's a major misconception that then sometimes we draw out of this passage, and I've heard this drawn a lot of times in how we interpret this passage, is major misconception to this verse. Because I think a lot of people read these verses and they think, well, Jesus is actually saying it's okay for David to have eaten the sacred bread because he's in need. That is the easy read there. Jesus said, hey, you're getting on my disciples. What about David? He was in need. He had the bread, so everything's cool, right? So let's be okay with that. It's easy to run to that. He was on the run. He's a good guy, so his situation made it okay for him, not a priest, to eat the bread that was for the priests. And we like to go down that rabbit hole. But Jesus was not setting aside the law of God. He was God. Remember? He wrote these laws. Why would he make a law and then say it was okay to set it aside if you had a real need? Besides, that kind of ideology leads to license, to allowing ourselves things we shouldn't allow ourselves. Justifying bad behavior on the basis of immediate need gives way to license. I had to. I had no choice. You don't know what it's like. Have you ever heard those things? Ever heard somebody say those things after they get in trouble? Ever said those things after you got in trouble? It leads to license on the total opposite end of legalism, to where we think anything goes because we were in need. What else was I supposed to do? I needed the money, and there it was. The cash register drawer was wide open. It was only 10 or 20 bucks, but I was in real need. God calls it stealing, right? My wife, this is hypothetical, okay? Don't run with this, and don't cut this part out and put it on YouTube somewhere. I'm speaking for someone else, but my wife doesn't love me anymore. I'm just so lonely, and this woman at work and I, we just hit it off so well. Doesn't God want me to be happy? You've heard it. You've heard it, haven't you? One of our biggest lead-ins to sinful behavior. Doesn't God want me to be happy? I prayed and I prayed that God would take these feelings and this attraction away from me, but he didn't. So what was I supposed to do? Be lonely my whole life? I knew a man that prayed that, and he struggled with that. A young lady says I was pregnant and single and I was still in high school. What choice did I have? You always have a choice. On any circumstance, any of it. Some of us may have been in these areas, and this is not a thing to beat us all down, but this is how license goes, and we get into these areas like this because our need necessitates it, and we think we don't have a choice and there's no other way out. You get the picture of how this works, and it leads into that. Jesus is not making allowances for sinning to get yourself out of a fix when he's saying this about the disciples and David and him eating the bread. Plus, if you read the whole story, you will see that David lied to Ahimelech when he came there, and he went to live with the Philistines, and he lied some more after doing that, and a lot of people died because of the things that David did that day. I wish we had time to go into it all, and if we go through the life of David, we will go into it all, but we'll study it all. But the priest and his entire village, you got to know this, the priest and his entire village, because David went into the tabernacle and got this bread from him, the priest and his entire village were slaughtered by the king who was looking for David because of it. Because they accused him of helping out the king's enemy. And it was treason. And they killed every man, woman, boy, and girl in that village. And the priest. Ahimelech's son, Abiathar, did survive, and he came to David. He kind of became the Friar Tuck of David's merry band. And he came to David, and he told him what happened. Turn with me to 1 Samuel 22, verse 22. I want you to see David's words on this. How this all ended up for him. Because in 1 Samuel 22, it says this, Then David said to Abiathar, that's Ahimelech's son, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell it to Saul. I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. How would you like to live with that? He came in, he concealed these things from Ahimelech, and he ate the bread, and things didn't go well. After that, we see David, though he even himself killed whole villages to cover up lies he told. Jesus is not condoning David's behavior. He is using it to give scale to the hypocrisy of the Pharisees who are arguing about rubbing grain in your hands on the Sabbath. He is giving them a picture of scale here. Rubbing, right? David. It's huge. Upset. Okay. You see what he's saying to him? What he is doing is pointing out that these religious men would never, ever condemn David, their favorite king, the king whose kingdom the Messiah was coming to restore, but they would happily condemn these 12 men who weren't even actually breaking any laws, just going against the religious traditions, and that was wrong. To look at King David and excuse what he's doing because he's our favorite and come down hard on these 12 people who aren't even actually doing anything wrong. He was calling them out on their hypocrisy in enforcing their beliefs. So you have to be fair with people and you have to apply your religious standards rightly. He's going to show us in another minute how we really apply them rightly, because there's one way to do it right. But you have to be fair. I mean, we have an example of it. We can look in our common culture, and I don't talk politics much, so I'm not going to mention names or get on which side I'm voting for. I'm not endorsing anybody or anything like that, but we look at, and we have two political parties in our country, and many times one party will do something, and we'll be okay with it, and the other party will do the same thing, and we get all upset about it. We're doing the same thing. And we have to be very careful about where we're placing favorite. Yeah, but this is my guy. He can do whatever he wants. This guy does it, I'm going to start throwing stones. It's hypocrisy. I'm guilty of it. And I see, oh, you going like this? You probably are too, you know? Unfortunately, we have the system we have, and without totally shielding one and throwing stones at the other, sometimes we just have to understand we got to pick the lesser of two evils, and that's kind of what we're left with, folks. It's how our system works here, but it's an example of the same kind of behavior. Excusing this and allowing this, or condemning this. Luke 6, verse 5. Back in Luke chapter 6, verse 5, Jesus still talking here. It says, and he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. This is where that key comes in. Because then, of course, he trumps everything, and he says, the Son of Man, that's the name he used for himself, remember, is the Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, he's saying, this is my jurisdiction. As God, I wrote this law. I will enforce this law. Not God's narc squad. That's not what we're called to be. But he's really asking them when he says that, who appointed you judge over these people? We don't see where God appointed the Pharisees to be the judges of all the people and what was right and what was wrong. What Jesus is on about in these verses is how we execute what we believe about what is right and what is wrong. What is allowable and what is condemnable? How do we live this out? How are we living out this truth? What we get from this passage is not an opportunity for license, like I said, a chance to allow some things that may be wrong or may even be just black or maybe gray or something like that, but we're really in need, so I need this, so it's going to be okay this time. That's not what it is allowing us. Jesus is not getting rid of the Sabbath there, and he is not being bipolar about his laws that he gave to mankind. He's not switching very quickly back and forth. We might wish he was, but he even told us in Matthew 5:17, he says, do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. He's not getting rid of the rules. We are not free to bend and change God's standards as our needs demand. He doesn't give us that right and that power. He is a righteous judge. And that's what he's saying. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He is a righteous judge. And this kind of license has given way to the condition we see in so many churches today that refuse to uphold God's word and his standards. It was in the news big this week of a certain denomination who is going to now start ordaining pastors and priests who are actively and openly in a homosexual lifestyle. It'd be surprising, but it was all over the news, not just in Christian areas, but all over the news. This is where churches have gotten, and this is how they've gotten there, by license and 1 inch and another inch and just one step at a time. But as we look at these things, we have to be fair and honest in how we apply God's words and his standards. Are we giving passes to people because of who they are and letting it slide? Are we being fair in our... maybe they're our friends, maybe they're our family members, so it's okay here. Maybe some of them are kind of our heroes. And so we look and we say, well, it's going to be okay for you, and it's going to be okay this time, or it's okay for me. Well, James 2:1 tells us, why don't you turn there with me, or we'll just have them put it up on the screen. My brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. He is telling us, that's James, the brother of Jesus, who may have been there on the day that Jesus took the Pharisees on like this, that we cannot have partiality in how we live out God's standards. We do God no favors when we let some people slip, but not others. And we enforce it here and not there. But better yet, he says, instead of doing that, Jesus says, let him be the judge. We are not God's narc squad. Isn't he the arbiter of what is right and wrong instead of us? Oh, we will share the word. We will share the word openly and honestly. I just have. It can be a very unpopular thing. But as far as going around pointing our fingers and wagging our fingers and beating people down, why aren't we letting God be the judge? He is the arbiter of what's right and wrong. And I'm not saying we drop our standards. I'm saying we look at ourselves as what we do. And that is where we look first. Turn with me to Luke chapter 6, verse 42. It's on page 50. It's right down from where we were just reading in the same chapter. Jesus says this to his disciples. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own? See the perspective again he's giving? Speck, log, right? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself cannot see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of that is in your brother's eye. I like the way Paul said it. If you'll turn over here one last time, Romans 14:22, he says, the faith which you have as your own conviction before God. I love the way the King James says it. Do you have faith? Have it to yourself. Where are we to turn our eyes first? To ourselves. Instead of judging everyone else. And that's what Jesus would have wanted for these Pharisees. Paul really touches on both of them, on both the points there, the license and the legalism. He says, maybe keep your eyes on yourself and your own business before you go around trying to fix everyone else. We would all do a lot better if we could master that. I think the world might call us hypocrites a lot less and see the validity of our message more clearly if we would just do that as well, instead of always pointing our fingers the other way. I think, like these Pharisees, it is much easier to judge somebody else's sin than it is our own. And that's where Jesus is going. We took communion today, and right in one of the passages that Pastor Gary read, as Paul is writing about communion, he says, a man must examine himself. Not a time to look around at everybody else and, oh, I know what their story is, and I know what his story is, and I know what her story is, and stuff like that. No, we examine ourselves. And if each of us would learn to keep our eyes on ourselves, we would all be doing a lot better, wouldn't we? Didn't make it all the way through this passage. I could have kept you here till 2 o'clock or so. So next week we're going to pick up right there. But next week we'll finish up this portion, which is so important. So I don't want you to miss that. But the motive for doing all of this is, believe it or not, the love of God. And that's where Jesus goes next. There is a right, there is a wrong. We look at ourselves, but we do it all in the love of God.